He walked out of the hospital room without a second glance. Just a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, headphones around his neck, and a silence so loud it shattered a future before it even began. The nurse tried to stop him, gently saying, "They need a father, sir," but he just muttered, "Not mine," and disappeared into the white corridor. Behind him in the neonatal unit lay two twin boys, barely a few hours old, crying in sync. They were beautiful, they were his, but they were also black. 26 years later, those same boys stood under blinding lights at the Grammys, shaking, crying, holding golden statues that weighed less than their childhood trauma. Cameras flashed. The world watched. And when the applause died down, one of them leaned into the mic and said, his voice trembling, not from nerves but from memory, "This one's for the man who left us." The crowd gasped, not because it was cruel, but because it was true, and somehow it was forgiving. This is not just a story about two boys becoming stars. It's a story about what's left behind when identity is denied, about what grows in the cracks of rejection, about how the echo of one man's silence became the sound that would shake the music industry. Their father, a promising white music producer in the 90s, known for talent, drive, and ambition, but also for running from responsibility. When he found out the woman he'd been dating, a black soul singer with dreams just as loud, was pregnant with twins, something shifted. And when the babies arrived, black as their mother, unmistakably not white, he vanished. He didn't die, he didn't go broke, he simply decided they didn't fit into the life he'd planned. A man obsessed with sound who couldn't handle the color of it. But here's the twist, he couldn't mute destiny. The twins grew up in foster care, bounced between homes, passed over again and again. But they had rhythm. Pain shaped their lyrics. Silence sculpted their beats. Music became the only place they were never abandoned. And as fate would have it, their sound started spreading, first the streets, then social, then stages. Until finally, tonight, they stood where they were never supposed to belong, at the top. And the man who left them, he watched it all, alone, in a dimly lit room, trembling not from pride but from regret. What do you do when the very people you erased dedicate their greatest moment to you? Stay with us, because this story will challenge what you think about family, race, forgiveness, and what it really means to leave something behind. Her name was Alana Rivers, a voice like velvet soaked in pain, with dreams too wide for the small bars she sang in. She was 23 when she met him. He walked into a downtown Atlanta lounge wearing a leather jacket and the scent of ambition. He called himself Rick Masters, not his real name, just his stage one. He produced underground beats that thumped through cheap speakers and whispered promises of a future too loud to ignore. When their eyes met, it wasn't just attraction, it was timing. She was chasing her shot. He was chasing his sound. And for a few months they created something beautiful. Music, memories, maybe even love, but beauty isn't always enough. When Alana told Rick she was pregnant, there wasn't a dramatic fight. No yelling. Just a quiet stiffness in the air, like the first second after a record scratches. "We're not ready," he said flatly. "You're not ready." But when the twins were born, two perfect boys with brown skin, tight curls, and eyes that mirrored both their parents, it was like the final thread snapped. Rick came to the hospital once. He stood by the window. He didn't hold them, didn't speak their names. The silence said enough. He left without signing a birth certificate, just left. Alana, heartbroken but not broken, named them on her own, Micah and Malik. She whispered their names like prayers in the dark. "You are not a mistake," she'd tell them over and over, even as the rent piled up, even as her gigs dried out and her voice began to crack from exhaustion more than melody. She wanted to raise them with music in their bones, but the world had different plans. 3 years later, a rare illness took her from them. It was quiet, just like Rick's exit, but it left more scars. Micah and Malik were sent into the foster care system, separated at first, reunited later. They bounced between families who liked the idea of black twin boys more than the reality. One family returned them after 6 weeks. Too much energy, they said. Another kept them for almost a year but never let them call them mom or dad. And through it all, there were no photos of their mother, no lullabies, no answers. They clung to each other like two halves of a song that only made sense together. School was tough. They were smart, but angry. Other kids teased them for not knowing who their father was. Teachers labeled them disruptive when they asked too many questions. One day, in 7th grade, a substitute teacher read Micah's file aloud by accident, mentioning paternal abandonment. The whole class laughed. Malik didn't. He punched the kid next to him who repeated it. He was suspended. No one asked why, but pain doesn't always rot. Sometimes it grows roots. They found an old beat machine in a community center. It barely worked, buttons missing, speaker blown. But to them, it was sacred. They taught themselves rhythm by mimicking heartbeats, by counting the creaks of the floorboards in the foster house, by freestyling verses about the holes in their shoes and the names they were never called. Music didn't save them, it gave them somewhere to scream. By 16, they were making full tracks on a borrowed laptop from a youth counselor who saw their fire. Their lyrics were raw, not polished, and full of questions the world never answered for them. They didn't rap about drugs or violence. They rapped about silence, about what it felt like to be erased before you were even named. One of their first songs, uploaded to SoundCloud under the name Echoes of Rivers, included a hook that simply said, "He made us with rhythm, then ran from the sound." No one paid attention at first. Then, someone did. A small-time producer named Leela Knox stumbled across their page and offered studio time. "I don't know who hurt you," she said, "but the way you turned it into this, it's holy." That was the first time someone outside of each other called them powerful. It stuck. Over the next few years, their fan base grew, slowly, then suddenly. TikTok took them viral. Their track, Father Figure, was used in over 200,000 videos. But the boys remained quiet about their past. No interviews about their parents. No mention of Rick Masters, who had long since stopped producing, now a middle-aged man managing a guitar store in another state, completely unaware the twins he abandoned were becoming the voices of a generation. But behind every beat they dropped, behind every hook that haunted listeners, was a question that never left them. Why weren't we enough for him to stay? They didn't want revenge. They didn't even want closure. They wanted the world to feel what it felt like to be forgotten. They wanted their music to scream louder than his silence. And it would, because the stage was coming. The moment was closer than they knew. And the man who'd erased them was about to hear them louder than ever before. Silence raised them louder than any voice ever could. After their mother's death, Micah and Malik were handed off from home to home, each time greeted with polite smiles and silent expectations. People said they were good kids, but only when they were quiet, as if their story didn't deserve to be spoken aloud. They learned quickly that being too emotional meant being difficult. Too curious meant ungrateful. And asking about their mother, or worse, their father, only led to looks of discomfort or a swift change of subject. So they stopped asking. They stopped hoping. They carried their pain in silence, tucked between shared glances and unfinished sentences only they could decode. No one told them much about Alana, just fragments. A singer, a dreamer gone too soon. Her photo wasn't in their files. Her voice never recorded. All they had was a feeling, something instinctual like a hum beneath their skin they couldn't explain. As for their father, he didn't exist. Not to the system, not to their caretakers, and eventually, not even in their own words. Rick Masters became a closed door they never dared to knock on. Their bond was unspoken but unbreakable. When Malik was accused of stealing from a foster dad who never trusted them to begin with, it was Micah who stayed up all night trying to fix the broken cabinet, hoping it would buy forgiveness. When Micah failed math for the third time because he couldn't focus over the yelling at home, Malik skipped basketball practice to help him study. They had each other, and no one else. So they learned to survive that way. Middle school was less about education and more about endurance. They were labeled fast, loud, confrontational, especially when they defended each other. Malik once shoved a kid who joked that even your parents gave up on you. He was suspended for 2 weeks. Micah, forced to sit through those days alone, realized that their anger wasn't the problem. It was the only thing people noticed. They didn't talk much about dreams. Dreams required stability. But on nights when the foster house was quiet and the wind made the windows hum, they would sit on the floor and beat rhythms into their knees, their chests, the cracked wood of the bed frame. Sound became their comfort, their code. Their mother had been a singer. Maybe music was inherited, or maybe it was all they had left of her. Everything changed the day they found the beat machine. It was old, missing knobs, duct-taped wires, donated to the community center with no instructions. But the moment they touched it, it felt like something shifted. They spent hours experimenting, layering sounds, building beats from scraps, plastic pencil taps, shoe squeaks, playground laughter. Music didn't save them, but it gave them space to exist. They began writing, freestyling, recording verses on a borrowed school iPad, whispering rhymes under their breath during bus rides. Their lyrics weren't about money or girls. They were about growing up without a mother's hug, about sharing socks, about being called nobody's children. They didn't make music for radio. They made it to breathe. One of their first tracks, called Echoes, had a line that stuck with people. He left with headphones on. We learned to scream in stereo. They didn't expect anyone to hear it, but someone did. A counselor at school shared it with a friend, who shared it with a local DJ, who messaged them late one night. I don't know who you boys are, but you just told my whole life in 3 minutes. He invited them to his home studio, a garage with egg cartons on the walls and a beat-up mic that smelled like hope. They recorded 4 songs that week, raw, real, rough, but alive. As their sound traveled online, comments started pouring in. This feels like my childhood. I didn't know how to talk about my foster trauma, then I heard this. Thank you for giving words to what I never could say. The boys read every message. Some made them laugh, some made them cry. All reminded them they weren't alone. Their story, once buried in silence, was now being sung back to them in echoes from strangers. But the struggle never really paused. They still shared clothes, still moved twice in senior year, still got called a trisque youth by teachers who never asked what they'd survived. Malik almost dropped out when a social worker told him he probably wouldn't make it to 20. That night, he disappeared for hours. Micah waited, panic growing by the minute. When Malik finally returned, he didn't speak. He handed Micah a notebook, open to a page that simply read, "We're not statistics, we're a sound they can't mute." That line became their next song. It went viral on TikTok within days. Suddenly, people knew their names. Not as those foster twins, but as voices that mattered. Still, they didn't speak about Rick. Not in interviews, not on social media, not even in their lyrics. Not yet. Because they knew that silence still held one more beat, one more verse. And when it dropped, it would change everything. They never planned to be famous. They didn't even plan to be found. Music had always been their shelter, not their spotlight, a place to store the anger, the ache, the questions that no foster file or therapist ever answered. But when Micah uploaded that video, late one night with Malik asleep beside him and the house dark, except for the blue glow of the laptop screen, something shifted. It wasn't meant for anyone beyond their tiny circle of listeners, maybe a few hundred kids on SoundCloud who knew what foster pain felt like. But that video, grainy, black and white, no beat, just Micah's voice cracking as he delivered a verse straight from the scar, hit something raw. Within 48 hours, it had been shared across Twitter, stitched on TikTok, sampled in underground remixes, and viewed over 1 million times. The world had been scrolling, bored, until they heard a line that stopped everything. "I ain't mad that you left. I'm mad that I still looked for you." It wasn't just a punchline. It was a confession wrapped in rhythm, a wound dressed in rhyme. Suddenly, people were talking, bloggers, artists, everyday kids from Brooklyn to Birmingham who commented, "This sounds like my life." Some cried. Others wrote them long messages that began with, "I never thought anyone else understood." That single verse became a spark, and everything they'd buried started catching fire. They called the track Father Figure, though they never said his name. They didn't need to. The pain had a shape people recognized. A producer named Leela Knox reached out not with a contract but with curiosity. She didn't promise stardom, just space. A modest studio, a quiet room with real equipment, a promise. You don't need fixing, you need to be heard. And so they went. For the first time in their lives, they walked into a place where they weren't being observed, judged, or rescued. They were simply respected. The first project they built with her was an EP titled Echoes of Her, a tribute to the mother they'd never really known, stitched together with imagined lullabies and soul samples that reminded them of warmth they'd only felt in dreams. The songs weren't polished, but they were pure. Gritty vocals layered with found sounds, a gospel hum Malik recorded from a street choir, the creak of their bedroom door looped into a beat, and over it all, verses that didn't ask for pity, just understanding. Within weeks, Spotify noticed, then NPR, then Rolling Stone, but the twins barely flinched. They didn't care about charts or clout. They cared about the messages, hundreds a day now, teens in group homes, grown men estranged from their fathers, mothers who had raised boys alone. "Your music said what I've never been able to say out loud," one message read. "You gave my silence a voice." Micah cried reading that one. Malik didn't say anything. He just played a new beat he'd been working on, a simple piano line that felt like sunrise. But even as they rose, they never stepped out of their truth. They refused labels that tried to smooth them over, refused interviews that wanted trauma porn, and never once said their father's name. It wasn't revenge. It was principle. "He left us in silence," Micah once told Leela. "So silence is what we give back." Still, the weight of that silence never left. Not in the booth, not on stage, not in the green room where Malik sometimes sat with his hoodie up, eyes closed, breathing through a pain the world was only just starting to understand. And then came the Grammy nomination. Best New Artist, Best Rap Performance. Just two boys from nowhere now being called the future of hip-hop, the soul of Gen Z, proof that pain can sing. It didn't feel real, but it was. Cameras followed them, producers called, stylists offered custom suits, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the look they gave each other when their names were announced. No words, just that same nod they'd used since childhood. "We're still here." The media frenzy exploded. Everyone wanted a quote. Everyone wanted the story. But when asked if they'd speak about their father if they won, they said nothing. They didn't owe anyone that moment. And yet privately, Micah had been writing something. A speech not for the press, not for the fans, but for the man he imagined sitting alone in a dark room, watching everything unfold. Rick Masters hadn't been in the industry for years. He worked at a music shop now, a shadow of the producer he once claimed to be. But when he heard that first verse of Father Figure, something inside him cracked. He didn't admit it out loud, but he watched their rise like someone watching the home they abandoned turn into a cathedral. He didn't need to say more. The rest would be music. The night of the Grammys didn't feel real. Not to Micah, not to Malik. It felt like something borrowed from someone else's life, like they'd stepped into a dream that didn't quite fit. The suits were custom, but simple, black, clean, nothing flashy. No chains, no designer logos, just quiet pride sewn into every stitch. Their shoes clicked against the red carpet like metronomes keeping time with their heartbeats. They didn't speak much, just exchanged small glances, nods that said everything, we made it. And yet deep beneath the shine and stage lights, a weight followed them into the building. Not nerves, not imposter syndrome. It was memory, the kind that sits in your chest like a held breath. The kind that whispers you're still those boys who fell asleep in shelters, who rapped in basements, who wrote verses in spiral notebooks while the world forgot your names. Inside, everything was larger than life. Stars moved like constellations in tailored suits and glittered gowns. The cameras flashed, the host cracked jokes, performances blasted through the speakers, but for Micah and Malik, the noise blurred into one long hum. All they could hear was the silence they'd come from, the echo of it still alive somewhere in their bones. They had waited for this moment, maybe even dreamed of it, but they never thought it would come like this. So loud, so quiet, so fragile. And then the category was called Best Rap Performance. The presenter, a rap icon they grew up idolizing, stood at the mic, gold envelope in hand. The pause stretched, and then came the words they would never forget. And the Grammy goes to Micah and Malik for Father Figure. For a heartbeat, nothing moved, not even them. Malik blinked. Micah exhaled. Then they rose together, slow and almost solemn, walking to the stage like they were walking through every memory they'd tried to survive. Every step forward was a step out of the past. When they reached the mic, the room was a sea of applause, but they barely noticed. Malik held the trophy gently, like it might break if handled too proudly. Micah reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It had been there for weeks, rewritten, stained, smudged, but never shown to anyone. Now, under the brightest lights of their lives, he unfolded it with trembling hands and spoke into the silence. "This one's for the man," his voice cracked. The crowd leaned in, the room holding its breath, who walked away before we could say his name. A murmur passed through the theater, not scandalized, but stunned, like a truth had just been named that no one expected to hear. "You weren't there to teach us how to speak," he continued. "You didn't show us how to shave, how to love, how to hold our ground when the world shook under us. But your silence gave us something else. It gave us space, and we filled that space with sound." Malik stepped in beside him, not needing a script. "We built a home out of rhythm. We made family out of bars and beats. We could have let your absence define us, but instead, we let it refine us. This moment isn't about revenge. It's about reclamation, of our story, of our name, of everything we were told we'd never be." The applause didn't just come. It roared. It rose like a wave crashing over decades of invisibility. People stood. Some clapped with hands over their hearts. Others wiped their eyes. It was more than a win, it was a homecoming. Backstage, journalists crowded, cameras followed, headlines were already being written. Orphaned twins deliver Grammy's most powerful speech. Pain turned platinum. A dedication heard around the world. But none of that mattered to them, because somewhere, far from the spotlight, in a quiet apartment surrounded by old records and forgotten dreams, a man watched the moment unfold on television. Rick Masters, once a promising name in the music industry, now just a face in the dark, stared at the screen like he was seeing ghosts. He hadn't heard their voices in over 2 decades, hadn't said their names since they were born. But now, hearing them speak, hearing them dedicate the pinnacle of their career to the man who abandoned them, something in him broke. Not instantly, not dramatically, just a soft, slow collapse of the walls he'd built to forget. He whispered their names, Micah, Malik, like they were prayers he didn't deserve to say. He didn't cry, he didn't move. He just sat there replaying their words over and over again. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like the victim of circumstance or a man misunderstood by time. He felt like a man who had walked away from gold before it had time to shine. And as the brothers stood on that stage, surrounded by applause but wrapped in something far deeper, they didn't smile for the cameras. They smiled for each other, because the award wasn't proof that they'd made it. The real trophy was that their voices, once silenced, once dismissed, had filled the world. And the man who left them, he was finally listening. Rick Masters didn't sleep the night his sons won a Grammy. He didn't even blink for a long time after the broadcast ended. The TV was still on, frozen in that final image, Micah and Malik, standing strong beneath blinding lights, holding gold in their hands, their faces still damp with tears, their voices still echoing in his head. The rest of the world saw triumph, but Rick saw something else, something harder to name. He sat there alone, surrounded by the clutter of a life paused mid-dream. Old records leaning against the walls, cracked vinyl sleeves, yellowing soundproof foam, an unused keyboard collecting dust in the corner. And yet none of it made a sound loud enough to drown out the silence he felt inside. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that builds like a storm, charged, heavy, unforgiving. For decades he'd lived in that silence, telling himself that walking away had been necessary. He wasn't ready. He wouldn't have been a good father. He didn't know how to raise black sons in a world he barely understood. He had turned absence into strategy, told himself it was mercy, told himself they were better off. But sitting there, alone in a dim room with the ghosts of beats he never finished and songs he never wrote, hearing his sons say his name without ever speaking it directly, he understood something he had been outrunning his whole life. They didn't need him to be perfect. They had only needed him to stay, and he hadn't. That night, he pulled out an old shoebox from the back of a closet he hadn't opened in years. Inside were pieces of a different man's life. Demo tapes, scratched CDs, a hospital photo of 2 newborns swaddled in blue and white, sleeping side by side like 2 hearts sharing one rhythm. He stared at the picture, trying to remember what it had felt like in that room, before fear took over, before shame became his compass. His hand trembled as he traced their faces with his thumb. He hadn't said their names in years, not aloud. He whispered them now. Micah, Malik. The words cracked like old wood. Something inside him broke open, not dramatically, not loudly, just a quiet collapse of the scaffolding he'd built to keep feeling out. He didn't cry for himself. He cried for them, for the childhood he had missed, for the birthdays he hadn't called, for the songs they sang without ever knowing his voice. In the morning, as light began to stretch through the blinds, he sat down at his desk, opened a faded notebook, and wrote something he never planned to send. Not an apology, not a justification, just a note, barely a paragraph. I saw you, I'm sorry, I'm proud, I'm listening now. He folded the page, sealed it in an envelope, and mailed it to the return address printed on the back of the album cover he had ordered anonymously the week before. He didn't expect an answer, but weeks later his phone rang, an unfamiliar number. He let it ring once, twice, then a third time. Something told him not to let it go to voicemail. He answered. Hello. he said, his voice rough with sleep and fear. There was a pause, then a voice, steady but soft, familiar but foreign. "Rick." He froze, his heart thudded once hard. "This is Malik." Rick didn't speak. "I got your letter," Malik said. The silence stretched long enough to breathe in. "I just wanted to say we don't need anything from you. We never did, but we wanted you to hear it from us. In our own voices. We're okay. We made it." Rick swallowed hard. His throat burned. "I know," he said, barely above a whisper. "And if you ever want to talk," Malik continued, "not about what happened, not about blame, just now, we're open to that." Rick's grip tightened around the phone. "I don't deserve it." There was a pause. Then Malik replied, "You don't have to, just don't disappear again." And with that, the call ended. Rick sat there holding the phone like it still contained a heartbeat. The room around him hadn't changed. The record still leaned, the dishes still sat in the sink, the lights still flickered. But something inside him had shifted. Not redemption, not forgiveness, just possibility. And for the first time in years, Rick heard something he hadn't heard since he walked out of that hospital room so long ago. A beginning, not from his own voice, but from the silence finally breaking. There was no big reunion, no cameras capturing hugs in slow motion, no headlines reading "Father and Sons Reunite." That's not how real healing works. It doesn't announce itself. It creeps in quietly like morning light through old curtains. Weeks passed after the call, and there were no dramatic gestures, no perfect endings, just small messages exchanged, brief check-ins, pauses that said more than words ever could. What began as a silence built on abandonment slowly became a silence built on space, space to breathe, to listen, to just exist. And for Micah and Malik, that was enough. They didn't need their father to erase the past. They needed him to stop running from it. And when he did, when he answered instead of hiding, when he listened instead of explaining, it changed something. Not everything, but something important. The world around them continued to turn. Interviews came and went. Features ran in magazines. Festival invites filled their inbox. And yet, none of it defined them the way people expected. They didn't chase celebrity. They weren't interested in being famous for their pain. They were artists now, storytellers, survivors, and above all, brothers who had built something sacred out of the ashes they'd been given. Their next album wasn't about revenge or even redemption. It was called Inheritance, not of wealth, not of legacy, but of truth. In it, they didn't retell the hurt. They retold the healing. The opening track was simply the sound of a man breathing into a phone, followed by the words, "I'm listening." That was it. No beat, no verse, just presence. And then the music began, richer, fuller, layered with harmonies and instruments they never had access to before. Songs about resilience, about home, about the mothers who raise sons alone, about the fathers who return not as heroes but as humans. One song, "Back Porch Sky," painted a picture of three men sitting under fading sunlight, not speaking, just listening to crickets and unfinished memories. Another, "Unsent Letters," was made entirely from actual messages fans had written them over the years, read aloud by strangers with voices that trembled. The impact was immediate, not because of fame, but because of connection. Their music became a mirror for those who had also been left, for those still waiting by doors that would never open, for those learning to forgive without receiving an apology. In classrooms, their lyrics were studied as modern poetry. In shelters, their songs played softly before lights out. And in the quietest corners of cities and small towns, people who had once felt invisible began to feel seen. But perhaps the most powerful change didn't happen on stage or in streaming numbers. It happened within them. For so long, Micah had carried anger like armor. It had protected him, pushed him, driven him to rap with fire. But now he found himself writing softer songs, humming more, letting silence live between verses. Malik, always the quieter one, began speaking more, on stage, in interviews with their father. He no longer needed to disappear behind beats to feel safe. He had found his voice and, more importantly, the courage to use it. And Rick, he never tried to become the father he was. He didn't ask to be forgiven. He just showed up in small, consistent ways. He sent records he thought they'd like. He texted them old photos of their mother. He asked questions and listened, really listened, even when the answers hurt. And though their relationship was fragile, imperfect, it was real, built not on guilt or obligation, but on the simple, radical act of being present. In interviews, when asked how they'd found the strength to forgive, Malik once said, "We didn't forgive to let him off the hook. We forgave so we could move forward without dragging chains behind us." And Micah added, "Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's remembering differently. It's rewriting the memory with music instead of silence." Their story didn't end with a Grammy. It didn't end with a phone call. It doesn't end at all, really. Because healing isn't a destination, it's a rhythm. A rhythm you learn to live with, some days offbeat, some days strong, but always forward. And as they stood on the rooftop of a building in their old neighborhood, watching the sun dip behind the skyline, Malik turned to Micah and said, "Can you believe we made it out?" Micah didn't answer. He just looked out at the city and whispered, "No, but I believe we're not going back." And in that moment, with no audience, no spotlight, no applause, just wind and memory and two brothers finally at peace, they both smiled. Because this was the real award, not the trophy, not the fame, but the sound of forgiveness humming quietly between them, steady as a heartbeat, soft as a second chance.